You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast, folks. It is the 19th of November, Tuesday. Suck month continues as Indiana, having knocked off Michigan, now fully into Ohio State week. If you don't know what Suck Month is, go back and listen to some earlier episodes. Happy to be joining you folks again. A full week of podcasts coming at you. And we've got a special guest joining us here on the show. First of all, before we get to that guest, just a reminder that we are part of the Back Home Network here at CrimsonCast, and we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and it's become the beating heart of college football. We see home field in every venue across the country, and it is now a competition between most men. How many pieces of home field apparel do you have in your closet? Or if you're like most men, you don't use the closet because there's probably an exercise bike somewhere that you could be piling stuff on instead. But I think I got asked yesterday, I'm up in the 70 or 80 range with home field apparel items, and I'm on the low end. I feel like I'm not pulling my weight fully with all of this, but tremendous types of shirts and hoodies and everything else, bomber jackets, whatnot. Get over to homefieldapparel.com. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. Again, homefieldapparel.com, your place to go for the finest in college fashion, and a proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and launch right into it. We've tried with the big matchups to bring in some perspectives from elsewhere. We have a guest that we've been hoping to get on, and I think we targeted this like a month and a half ago. Dane, I think, was when this was first mentioned as a possibility, and I was thrilled that you wanted to come on. But former Ohio State great Dane Sanzenbacher, who's a regular on 97.1 The Fan in Columbus, joining us on the show. Dane, great to have you on, and welcome to CrimsonCast.
Galen, it's surreal to be here, to be honest with you.
You want to explain why it's surreal?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of media. I've done a lot of radio. I've done a lot of podcasts. This one will by far make me the most famous in my own household. So yeah, for those that don't know, I married a Hoosier. So actually, Galen, she was at was it broadcast journalism at?
It was, I don't remember what her degree was in. It might have been sport comm broadcast, but it was somewhere in that realm.
I should know that.
That's fine.
Yeah,
everything changed while Allie was here. And so, we switched over to the media school while she was here. But Allie Hausfeld, some of you may remember, we have a lot of folks who've been following IU student media and IU sports media for a while, but Allie was a regular on Big Ten Plus for us, did a lot of those broadcasts, did a lot of the TV items as well, worked in television, which is where you two met in Toledo. And we've not only stayed in touch, but it's been great because Allie's become part of the small circle of people that I text regularly with about IU football. So that makes this particular week, the matchup, you on, all of these things, like even more special as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So she's now Allie Sanzenbacher. And so I have been just indoctrinated into IU fandom and culture. She's a bigger fan than I've never been a very good fan. Obviously I was very involved. I mean, as a player, it's tough to be a good fan after, but I've realized what the IU fandom is all about. Her mother, sister, everybody's IU grad. So I'm the lone. I'm always in these games. So I have season tickets, and we go every year to the Ohio State Indiana game. And I'm always the one of five. I'm wearing the Ohio State stuff, obviously, and I'm bringing all the Hoosiers into town. Well, typically it's a friendlier environment. It's going to be a little bit different this time around because it's feeling like a real threat. So now that I'm walking in with my group of Hoosiers, we'll see how this one goes this weekend.
Yeah, it's a different type of thing. I mean, normally, IU is just not a team historically that Ohio State has ever had to take seriously at any step along the way. And there have been games, obviously, that have been closer than one might expect. There were a couple of games, especially during the Kevin Wilson era, where it was like, oh, wow, IU's putting up a fight. It's kind of where the chaos team moniker came from. Famously, I think, what was it, was it 2015 or 2016, the game where there was a I think it was 2015. It was like a throw to the back of the end zone that might have tied it up and sent it to overtime in one year or something like that. I mean, there's been a couple games like that. Yeah. Kevin Wilson had a game like that. But realistically, I mean, you just have to look at the win-loss records over the course of history. And this has been completely dominated by Ohio State. This setup coming into this week at the Shoe is unlike anything I've seen in terms of an Indiana matchup versus anybody, let alone Ohio State, a top 5 matchup in mid-November with real implications, like real stuff on the line, not just for Indiana. Like everybody's been talking about, this is the game, this is the measuring stick for Indiana. Like they have to play well or they might not make the college football playoff. There's significant implications for Ohio State in this game as well. And I'm fascinated, and I know a lot of IU fans are fascinated by, like, how is this being processed by the Ohio State fan base and by the media? Because this is just not something that you've had to compute up to this point when Indiana is concerned.
Yeah, I think, and obviously, like we don't miss a podcast, Galen. So we're well caught up on all the CrimsonCast and all the others that are on the regular every time that we're in the car. Yeah, so I know there is a lot of, obviously, the general national media is focused a lot on the Indiana side of this, of what this means or what this plays out. You mentioned it means a lot to Ohio State too. And I think that kind of gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. But yeah, processing this as, this is Indiana. It doesn't feel locally in the media here. I feel like, I don't think anybody's sleeping on this one. And I'm hoping that, from a selfish Ohio State side, that the players take it that way. But yeah, this isn't like and I think maybe it's because it's so late in the year. I honestly think this is one of those games that, like, it might be to Ohio State's advantage that this one is so late, because catching this Indiana team early in the year, you might get snuck up on. Yeah. Like you didn't know. Who knew what they were? I mean, it's a brand new team, brand new roster, brand new coach. You couldn't have, even if you did all the metrics of how these players, it's impossible to predict that. So yeah, if you're Ohio State early in the year, these are the one-off games that every once in a while they would get caught by by Purdue or Northwestern, or you'd have a game with Indiana.
Yeah, I think it happened with Iowa one year too, right?
Yeah. So I'm thinking that, my thought and the feeling around here feels like this is so late in the year and with so much implication. And plus, IU's got like a number 5 by their name. I think they're 5th right now. It's tough to sleep on that one. And you could go down the haven't played anybody route, but haven't played anybody close either. Right. Kind of run away from most except Michigan.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a lot of discourse. Indiana's had the bye this past week, and Ohio State goes up to Wrigley and as expected handles Northwestern in that game. But a lot of the discourse around Indiana that's grown over the course of the bye week has been what you said. Well, they haven't played anybody. They'd have 3 losses or 4 losses against an SEC schedule, which is kind of a garbage take for a variety of reasons. But what's interesting to me about the way that all of this has been processed in the media, and especially as it relates to Ohio State, is it assumes that Ohio State is at 100% and is playing, as the dominant team that they always are. And they have certainly played better in the last couple of weeks, but they did struggle in that Nebraska game earlier on in the year. They lost the game at Oregon. It's a close game. They were certainly right in it until the very end. But a lot of people, I feel like, that have carried that particular narrative through this week into this game, they haven't really watched Indiana play very closely. I've seen a lot of people making comments on Indiana, and they haven't, as much as we talk about the eye test in college football, it feels like there have been no eyes on Indiana that didn't watch the second half of the Maryland game or the Nebraska game or the Washington game. A lot's been pinned on that Michigan game, and yet Indiana was up 17-3 at half in that game, and kind of ran into some offensive struggles in the second half. Like, this is a team that has played really well, as you mentioned, in almost every game. And normally it feels like Ohio State, especially in this spot the week before Michigan, is playing one of the lesser teams in the conference. Oftentimes Indiana in this
usually playing Indiana.
Right. Yeah. And
what I should say, Indiana.
Right. In big air quotes.
That's not what we're looking at here.
But, I mean, the Ohio State perspective is kind of an interesting one because, look, they're favored by, I think it's up to 13 and a half. They should be favored. Statistically, as good as Indiana's been, Ohio State's been better in most of the metrics. And yet you look at Ohio State and it's I'm not going to call it a must win because I think they could lose the game and still make the college football playoff field. Because even with 2 losses, they'd be fine. But there's a Big Ten championship berth on the line, a chance to get back at Oregon for the loss you had earlier in the year. And there's also that just kind of the uncertainty about what happens in the next few weeks in the college football playoff landscape. I heard a podcast earlier today where it's like a lot of the pressure is really on Ohio State in this one. Like, as long as Indiana plays relatively close, I think people are going to be like, well, that's fine enough for Indiana because, I mean, you would know the number better than I do. How many teams have walked into the shoe in the last decade and won? It outside of Michigan, it feels like a very small number.
Yeah, Michigan, Oregon, USC. When I was there, it's not a big number.
But for Ohio State, it's like, the expectation is you need to show separation from Indiana. You need to win the game. You need to put yourself in a position where you play like the dominant team people have been saying that you are, because then that sets you up in case you do lose a second time to Oregon in the Big Ten title game, like where exactly you land in the college football playoff pecking order. And it's weird because this Indiana team has brought a level of physicality that is completely foreign to anybody that's watched Indiana football, including Indiana football fans. Most of us are like, it's like an alien team got beamed down in place of them that's playing this kind of hard-nosed football, which essentially won the game for them against Michigan.
Yeah, I think a lot of there obviously after this game, there will be a ton of speculation one way or the other. But I think even looking past this game is a step too far. I mean, I think they match up well. I mean, I think there's not a glaring weakness in either team. And I've watched a fair amount of Indiana football, more than obviously, because that's what's on in my TVs in my house. As my 2-year-old son is singing, "Never daunted, I will not falter." And then that's not going to work in Columbus, buddy, but we'll figure that out.
I need to buy him something and bring it this weekend.
I think we already had our home field Never Daunted shirts show up. So I've seen a fair bit of Indiana, and there's not a lot of glaring spots that you could say Ohio State can definitely go expose that. I mean, I think, being in the media in Columbus and just living here and kind of living through it, we're notoriously hard on Ohio State, even though, we've lost one game by 1 point to the number 1 team. If you listen to a lot of our podcasts and radio, we'll find weaknesses for you. We'll find things. So it's like, we don't feel that we're perfect going in. And I think we look at, especially an offense like Indiana has, that's something that I hear constantly of like, okay, now we have a good defense, but that's like, the offense that Indiana has shown thus far, that type of offense and the skill guys that they have moved the ball on Ohio State. Like, so that, the matchup is there. And I think it's as big a game, you're right, for Ohio State. I mean, I think you've got, in a program like this too, you have so many other forces at play too. I mean, we've consistently been in the playoff. We've had a lot of winning seasons, but lost to Michigan 3 times, which that puts in Columbus, that puts a dark cloud on the program, in that a loss to Indiana for this staff and team. And that's not even saying, it's not even downing Indiana. It's one of those type of things when you're in this environment, similar to what you guys would have in like your typical basketball.
Totally.
Like Indiana basketball, that expectation there, that's like, if you kept losing to Purdue, and then you lost to like,
wouldn't know what that was like.
Yeah. Can you imagine? We lived through those too. Trust me. I mean, we'll get back into that one, but so like there's that at play too. So I think this team, and especially staff, is well aware of the stakes going into this game, because everybody knew at the beginning of the season, Michigan's your must win. Like, we don't really obviously you are supposed to have the most talented team in the country. We expect this out of you, but must beat Michigan. And this game pops up with an Indiana team who is a legit Indiana team the week before. I mean, I don't think you can afford to look past this one. And I think those guys know, like, you know, a loss to Oregon, okay. It's a little bit tougher to see. And putting aside any playoff implications, a loss to Indiana at home, you know, that would be tough for Columbus to take lightly.
It's a really interesting scenario because you go back and you look at the results from previous years. You know, last year, you know, you lose to Michigan, undefeated up to that point, but hadn't played a ranked team since Penn State in the middle of October. You know, the year before that, you know, the loss to Michigan, but then it had been 3 weeks without a ranked opponent. Again, Penn State, you know, just you're going to beat Penn State. That's what you guys do. It's very rare that you have a couple of ranked opponents. Like the last time I think it happened was 2021. And that's an interesting, if you're an Ohio State fan, I think that's where you're pointing at, because you come in against a Michigan State team that was significantly overachieving that year and just waxed them. I think it was like 56-21 was the final. And it really kind of put to bed the idea that Michigan State was an actual national contender. You know, and that kind of DNA for Ohio State in terms of being able to handle that in the lead up to the Michigan game, which, as you said, is clearly more important culturally, that's there. And, you know, I think, you know, if you're Ohio State, it feels like to me like the big advantage you potentially have and historically have against all Big Ten opponents that aren't Michigan is that psychological advantage of we are Ohio State. We are built for these games. We win these games. We have the 110,000 people in the stands. It's a very hostile environment. It's going to be cold. You know, that has been a powerful arbiter of how a lot of these have gone, because a lot of teams get defeated mentally and emotionally before they even go into that environment because they're like, well, we can't handle that, and Ohio State can.
That's a real thing. I mean, I think you'll have the advantage to a lot of your new players. They don't have any preconceived notions. I think I've heard you talk about this a little bit, even maybe leading up to the Michigan game. I mean, they don't have any bad feelings or bad memories about Michigan coming into town. It's just like, okay, here's a big opportunity for us. Yeah, I think there is something to be said for that with big programs and Ohio State and the Michigans, and like carrying that, like, even if it's not your own personal experience, that known experience that this program knows how to handle these moments, that is there. And I think that is part of, you can see it sometimes in whether it's Big Ten teams or teams that you're supposed to beat, a point in which they feel it. And then you're just like, okay, they notice it. You saw it when Purdue came to town. Like, there's just a point where you're just like, oh man, you know, this is, and it just gets overwhelmed. But I think there are a couple things Indiana has going for it in this matchup is, one, you get a noon game. You're not going to get the full weight of what Ohio Stadium is. You just won't. I mean, it's a great, you've been there. It's a great venue. It gets loud, right? I've played in, there's a lot of Big Ten stadiums that get really loud, but if you're at a noon game, you're not going to get the full weight of that. Okay. You're not going to get the full, like, that's going to be the 12th man. So, I mean, I think that's part of what is an advantage for Indiana. And I think too, that, you know, a lot of, so let's say Purdue, for example, or some other, who else did we have earlier in the year? A couple of them, there's been a lot of teams with talent, especially with transfer portal and people being able to bring people in. We've taken a lot of teams.
Like Iowa earlier in the year.
Sure. Yeah. Like, we've taken a lot of teams' best shots early in the game.
Yeah.
What it feels like sometimes is Ohio State just leans on teams for a while. And at a certain point, third and fourth quarters, at some point the dam breaks. Kind of happened in Northwestern. Northwestern got out to a really good start last week. Ohio State is very, they're deep in a sense that they have talent at all of their positions. And at a while, that's burdensome. You can't play at your absolute top level if you're the opponent for a long time. So I don't know how that plays out with Indiana. I think obviously beating Michigan at home, and I give them a lot more credit for that than I think the general consensus would, because Michigan isn't. They're just fine this year,
Right.
but they've got some players. You saw them; they got after Rourke a little bit. They still have those 5-star, big, like really, really talented players. So I think that's I really think like the third and fourth quarter will tell the tale of this one, of what that looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting because you've listened to the show. You've heard me lament this for years. The difference between the upper echelon of the Big Ten and all the other teams is, and Zach Osterman's brought this up many times on his podcast, when you can play your best players 20% fewer snaps because you have so much depth behind them that you don't have that drop off. Indiana doesn't have that. Purdue doesn't have that. You're having to play your guys deep into the fourth quarter without the level of rest. You're going to get ground down eventually. And, as you said, especially in games that are close, I think it kind of happened against Nebraska to some degree. Like Ohio State was able to outlast them just that much.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, and this is where this particular game and when it's happening fascinates me so much, because there's a couple things about this IU team that are very different. The mentality is like nothing I've ever seen in an IU team. This is, and you look at the way that they handled the Rourke injury against Washington. You look at the way they handled the early 10-point deficit against Michigan State, a place that they have not historically won. You look at the way they handled the Nebraska game and even the second half of the Michigan game. We've seen IU teams not have the mental fortitude or the emotional resiliency to be able to stand bad things happening.
Yeah.
And this team over and over again has demonstrated that they thrive in those situations. And it extends from Cignetti. He has somehow microwaved this culture where all these guys believe they can win every down. They believe they can get first downs. They can drive down the field. They have very short memories. And that is really rare, I feel like, in a lot of Big Ten. Now, they haven't played in this type of an environment. They haven't played a team as good as Ohio State. So I am curious to see, does that culture survive that particular acid test? But as I've gotten used to saying with this IU team, every time I'm like, I don't know if I can trust them to do that or believe that they're going to do it, they've done it. So it's one of those where I've got to say, until I see them not do it, I'm going to believe that they're going to do it somehow.
That's the biggest question to me. And that's what I'm most looking forward to watching. I think you could break down the X's and O's of this all day. You could break down of where the rank is, where could be the weak points. How does the offensive and defensive lines match up? There's some stuff with how do our corners they've given up some big plays. How does that match up? But I think the most interesting part is what you just mentioned, is that okay, but on average, talent-wise and production we've seen so far, this isn't a far and away advantage for either team. The question is how does that play out? How does the part where, the over story of this thing of Ohio State is, dominant in the Big Ten for years, in Indiana, who hasn't been in this arena before, when do we see that part? Because it's got to tip one way or the other, right? Yeah. During the game, there's going to be a point where and these are human beings too. These are college. Right. They're well aware of the expectation here. The Ohio State sideline is well aware that this is what we do. This is our place. This is our next step. This might be a good team, but this is a game we win. And Indiana is well aware that we have not been in this spot. And everybody says that Ohio State is this powerhouse. Now, that's the challenge for the coaches of how you get them believing. Obviously, Coach Cignetti has done a great job thus far, and I think you're in a really great spot to have a group that doesn't know any better. Yeah. You're rolling in with a team that has, for their eyes, that they've seen that group's been together with IU uniforms on. They've rolled through and looked at each other and been like, I don't know, why not? Yeah. Okay, and won. I don't know, why not? And won. And so there's no reason for me to say they haven't shown that they've been daunted, if you will. IU fans.
There you go. That's good.
They haven't shown that. So, I mean, I don't see a reason to that's what I'm most wanting to look at. And that's what's so intriguing about it, even for the non-Big Ten or casual viewer. It's not quite a David and Goliath on the field, right? But as far as the history of these two programs in football, it's David and Goliath. Yeah. The talent is pretty equal on the field, but you're going to see like how much the weight of our histories show up here. And if they show up, and I mean, I think that's part of the draw and the narrative of this game.
One of the things that I'm really curious about, so Curt Cignetti and his staff, who have done an amazing job this year, have had 2 weeks to game plan for this game. And that, I think, is an underrated advantage for Indiana, in that clearly things had been figured out a little bit by Michigan. I think if you go back and watch that Michigan game, they did a lot that hurt the passing game, which has been Indiana's bread and butter in terms of moving the ball in the middle portion of the field. They were sitting on particular routes. They were really forcing Rourke into some uncomfortable situations. A lot of people criticize the offensive line of Indiana. I thought the offensive line actually played fine in that game. But Michigan did a lot of things that harmed the passing game. Indiana had some drops, which were uncharacteristic. And, Ohio State is a better version of that defense by a significant margin. They have not allowed a lot of points. What are they, like 10.5 points allowed this year or something like that per game? But I have a feeling like a fully healthy Curtis Rourke and a Curt Cignetti and Mike Shanahan, and it's more Shanahan and Sinceri, obviously, who would be saying, all right, what do we need to do to try to exploit whatever weaknesses there are in the Ohio State defensive alignment? I guess my question for you is, like, what do you think they're going to try to target? The Indiana's going to try to run the ball. They're going to do a lot of RPOs. They've got 4 or 5 legitimate receiving targets on every down, and that's been very difficult for teams to defend. And a lot of it is how much time does Rourke have once he decides on the RPO? If he's going to pass, where's he going with it? If you were trying to design something against this Ohio State defense, what would you emphasize?
Yeah, I think that's why I think they match up so well with Ohio State, is because their strength is something that's had success against Ohio State. I think if Curtis Rourke has time to sit back, that's when they've been able to make plays. Obviously, they will try to be as balanced as they can with, like any good offense would be. You can't just do one thing. And they have the playmakers that have allowed that for them this year. But I think when we look at the Oregon game, or any game where offenses have had success, it's when Ohio State's defense has felt like they're just kind of catching, and there's no pressure on the quarterback. And it doesn't matter how good you are as a defense or defensive backs. If you've got a quarterback that's at the level that these guys are, that, Dylan Gabriel and Curtis Rourke has shown to be this year, they're going to make plays. They're going to pick you apart. So, I mean, to me, if you're going to try to attack this defense, that's where it's been shown that they can make plays. Now, the tough part is actually scoring.
Right.
We've given up chunk plays. Like, they've been willing to, there's been some big plays, and no really huge ones, but there's been some passes completed. But really, when it's gotten down into the red zone, the defense has been very good. And I don't know, you would know more than me about how Indiana's red zone efficiency is. I'm sure it's good. I'm guessing just based on the points they've put up. But that's where the test has kind of been. The Oregon game's kind of an outlier because a lot of weird stuff happened in that game. But for the most part, it's been can you score in the red zone? And most teams have struggled to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it is going to be a huge thing. I mean, Indiana has done a really great job of putting themselves in position where they can convert. They've been the best team in the country in EPA per passing play. And they've made so many red zone trips. I think I saw something like 40, like Indiana leads the country in offensive drives that enter the red zone. And that includes drives where you're scoring from a long distance and things like that. But it's like 49.5% of Indiana's drives have ended up in the red zone or in a score. And that is going to be really fascinating because I think, for Indiana, They saw some of that against Michigan. They saw some of it against Washington, who I think played an underrated, really good defensive game, where they started to get stymied a little bit in shorter yardage situations. And this is where it's like you got to go back to the workshop. This is something that people forget about. Like by week 11 or 12 of the college football season, where we're at right now, there's so much film on what you've done. There's so much on what you've called, what the tendencies are, certain players of the quarterbacks, that, to have a moment in time where you can say, all right, let's install some new things, or let's put twists on things that confuse people because they're expecting us to do X and we do Y instead. You can't do too much of that because you don't want to confuse your own offense in that case. So there's a balance that has to be struck. But this offensive staff for IU has been in their bag for so long this year, especially having a bad offensive game against Michigan. It's like maybe that does say to them, all right, now's the time to tweak what we're doing so that we can continue the kind of success we had earlier on in the year.
They've been, what I've liked about Indiana's offense, though, from what I've seen of it, is it seems they seem to keep things pretty simple. And that's in comparison to like watching Ohio State. If you've watched Ohio State this year, and I'm sure you're going to see it this weekend, they are moving all over the place. That offense is in constant motion. There's not a time where I think they line up without emotion. It's a lot of misdirections. It's a lot to look at, and they've obviously had some success with it. But what I like about Indiana's offense is it's just been simple and effective. And that's what it's kind of feels like a reflection of Coach Cignetti's personality, or his approach to football as a whole. Is like a lot of it just seems like very matter of fact. This is what we're going to do. Football's not that complicated, essentially. And I don't know if he said that, but like when I watch their games compared to like Ohio State's, it feels like doing a lot of high level stuff. Indiana has been like, okay, let's just get good at these things. It's easy to adjust. This is how the game is played. They can only do so much. So, I think they're kind of well suited for this time of the year. Yeah, sure, there's going to be tendencies and everything, but they haven't been that complicated to this point, and nobody's really given them a real hard time. I don't know. That's why I say this one is like, if you're looking at the X and the O's, it's a toss up. You could talk yourself in circles.
And yet the statistics say Ohio State is definitely favored. And a lot of that, it's interesting. The expectation seems to be based upon the advanced stats that Ohio State will be able to hold Indiana's offense in check. I think S&P Plus has Indiana projected to score 19 points while Ohio State scores 31. I am interested in Ohio State's offense. And, we've heard a lot about the injury situation at left tackle, but this is still a very good Ohio State offense. They're third, I think, in the Big Ten in rushing offense. They're fourth or fifth in passing offense. They've been a really good seasoned unit that has put a lot of points on the board. For Indiana, their defensive line play has gotten better and better every week. Their secondary is still the big question mark. And so a lot of it feels like, can Indiana do the things they need to do to take away what Ohio State does best offensively, which is, Ohio State converts on what I think 83% of their drives, end up going to first downs. They're really good in early down EPA. They're really good in line yards. Like their line gets a huge push generally in rushing. They've clearly been good in the past. Like, what are the weaknesses that Indiana has to try to hone in on? Or is Ohio State just like, are they that good that it's really more about just trying to force Ohio State into mistakes, not necessarily being able to stymie them offensively? Like, what was it that Nebraska did that allowed them to have the success they had, where they only had Ohio State score 21 points in that game?
Nebraska specifically, I think they had the ball a lot too. I think they didn't take the air out of it, but they had such success on offense. They had good drives and moved it enough, even if they didn't get points on every drive, that there wasn't much time to score a bunch of points. I think we scored some. I know we scored some, but we had to score some, but not as much as normal. I don't know. They're Ohio State is very sound at everything, and that's not even like a homer take. They statistically have been good at everything. Their defense, we pick on it in the local media, but nationally it's pretty good. The offense, we could say like, oh well, our quarterback's not in Heisman contention. He's played really well. He's done his job. So, I mean, I just like, it's the factor that's out there. Like we were talking about this, it was even this was lead up to, I don't know, the Oregon game, or if like, it's Alabama coming to town. I think like you look at this and dissect it and you say like, okay, you could make a reasonable assessment about how this is going to go. But I think, the elephant in the room, the thing here is that this is like Indiana. We're having the conversation of the X and the O's of an Indiana team that is like really legitimate. And how does that play out on the field? Like, because I do think that is a factor. You mentioned it before. There is this thing, like a lot of times when you're having, I guess what I'm saying is this level of conversation about an Ohio State game, right? An opponent that you're saying like, I don't know if they match up here. Well, we're a little better here. You're a little better there. It's a big time matchup. I mean, it's an Oregon game. Yeah. It's Penn State, but like this is a legit top 5 matchup. But the question is like, how does the narrative weigh on the people on the field and on the coaches? Because they're going to say they don't notice and they're going to say they don't know it. But, this is one that like it has to start to tilt one way or the other.
Yeah.
Either you're proving everybody right or you're proving everybody wrong. It's like, and I think that's a factor in the game.
Yeah. It's one of the two that hasn't been talked about very much because it's an intangible. You can't look at numbers because you just don't know. And look, I think you got to give the benefit of the doubt to Ohio State because they've been in far more of these games than this group of Indiana players has been in. And I think it's important to remember that can be a benefit though, like, because as we talked about earlier, there's one of the things that the transfers, not just the James Madison transfers, but the guys from Wake Forest and from Texas Tech that have really comprised this team, it's like eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, right? Like, you haven't been in situations where you've lost at the Horseshoe, you've lost at the Big House, and all of this Indiana team has experienced is success. And they're coming off of probably the biggest game in the recent program history, the win at home against the defending national champions, which propelled them to a 10-0 record and a likely spot in the college football playoff. You've been through that. You feel like you've got momentum or lady luck or whatever you want to call it on your side. That can be a powerful thing if you don't know any better. And I'm really curious to see how that goes. And I think Cignetti, having been around Alabama as they were on the come up and they were taking players that hadn't been in effective positions before and turned them into a perennial national title contender, he's going to likely know what buttons to push to make sure his players have the right mindset as they come into this. And that's going to be really fascinating to watch.
Yeah. Well, and this is the step, right? Like, so that's why this is so fun that this matchup happens at this point in the year, because it's not like a 5-0 Indiana team. It's not like, okay, you've won the first part of your schedule. This is like, okay, you're looking at a 10-0 team coming in that is, I guess the first part of like for Indiana as a program to take that next step is this lead up week, right? Is getting yourself into the media is now talking, and even, you guys, podcasts, fans, the fact that you've taken a step towards the X's and O's of like actually comparing these two teams to each other is huge. Like that's a program changing step. Not like, okay, how in the world do we hope this team gets COVID? Do we like, how do we match up here? But it's like the threshold has been broken to you're at a point where an Ohio State game and you're getting like true football analysis, right? You're like actually trying to find weaknesses. And so like, I think, yeah, like it or not, like if Indiana's going to take a next step as a football program, that the keys to the Big Ten do at this point go through Ohio State.
Absolutely.
And Ohio State and Oregon, and usually Michigan. So you got your chance at the big guy, beat Michigan at home. So they were a little weakened. That's still a huge win for the program. And and that's what for Ohio State fans, we know this is a really talented team. Like, you're not catching a limping Ohio State team. This is a good team. But it's like, if there ever was a time, you're getting a storm of guys that this is a good Indiana team. And this is a good Indiana team, yeah, coming to Ohio State, but won't be the most hostile environment. I mean, it's going to be a noon game. And this is an Indiana team that has no bad baggage. I mean, it is a fresh Indiana team that is very, like, they're not carrying a lot of skeletons of tough losses. So like that formula, I think it gives pause to a lot of Ohio State fans, in that this is always typically a look ahead week for the fans. I don't think that's like really a thing for players, but that this is now like we're looking at this week, because I mean, it's as likely a time as ever. If Indiana is ever going to take a step as a football program, at some point, you're gonna you have to be able to take down the big guys. That just is what it is.
Yeah.
But I feel like at the stage that we're now talking about that, and you're in a good place.
Last thing, let me ask you, because I actually don't know who this favors. I haven't thought about it yet, but I just checked the weather forecast for Saturday, and it's not a good weather forecast. Right now, they're projecting 47 with a real feel of 39 degrees with rain, 14-mile-an-hour west-northwest wind with gusts to 27.
I would say,
is it too late for me to put in for press passes? I guess would be the first question I would have.
That is actually what I was just thinking about, Galen, because I passed up on sweet tickets to sit with my wife and 5 IU fans down in the stands. So I'm just actually going through that right now. I think in these, I mean, that almost always favors the underdog. As much as you could say Indiana's an underdog, I don't buy the 13 points personally, but if that's what it is. But I had lunch with Coach Tressel earlier this year, and we were talking a little bit about looking forward, and obviously the chatter in Columbus is still on Michigan, is still getting over that hump for this group. And Michigan's obviously weakened this year. They're not what they were last year. But he was basically like, for that one and for a lot of these, the big unknown is weather. You could get into November and there's enough players on that team that if you can't throw the ball, if things get messy, it's kind of up for grabs. So, I mean, this is one of those, I mean, it's the reason they play a lot of the championship games in domes where you can control it, because then you're getting the best versions of everybody. We haven't played in I don't think Indiana has either, a real mess of a game. Oh, they just won. Yeah.
The Maryland game, that was the Helene game. And it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it was rainy and windy, and that was a messy game. And Indiana not only won that game, but won it going away and won it using the passing game as much as they did the running game.
Yeah. So two reasons that, one is it typically favors, because it evens the playing field. You're both playing in crappy weather. And two, that's another point against your home field advantage. I mean, I don't want to sit out there and scream. I mean, you're gonna have a little bit less, so it just evens it a little bit more.
Might need a little snifter or some Hard Truth Hills coming with me for that.
Yeah,
it's a little warming device,
something like that.
Man.
But I mean, how good? I mean, I know I've listened, and you've talked about this on most of your podcasts, but I mean, has this just been an amazing year for somebody like yourself and the fan base that doing these shows in real time, covering, like, it's easy to look back on it, but I know you guys do this every year. Yeah. I mean, you guys do it with the 1 and 9
when no one's watching and no
one's watching, and
people are making fun of us. Yes,
I should go. I mean, I haven't listened to all of them, but I can just imagine, like, in real time, like, oh, we won again. Oh, we won again. I did listen to the one where it dawned on you that, like, oh wait, we actually could be talking about the playoffs. And now you're looking like it's very likely.
I mean, it's funny you say that, because I was going through this sequence in my head, because it was real quick between, wow, IU might be good, to IU might be a playoff contender. And what did it was the turnaround in the fourth quarter against Northwestern. I was standing in the south end zone. I got Eddie Cotton with me and Teddy Bailey and that whole group. And where, Indiana's really struggling offensively, and Northwestern chips back and I think gets within 3. And it's like, oh boy. And then they rattle off 17 points or whatever is down the stretch, or 14 points. They end up winning the game. And I'm like, there's a bye the next week. And I'm looking at that list, and it's like, well, they got Nebraska, they got Washington, they got Michigan State on the road, they got Michigan at home. Man, if they could win all 4 of those games, it's a completely different stratosphere. And every week that pressure, but also the excitement build, and be able to talk through that in real time has been unlike anything I've experienced as a podcaster. And I'll never experience anything quite like this again, because to watch this team, crawl out from the pit it had descended into in the last few years of the Allen era, and just the despair. I mean, Cignetti even mentioned it his first day on the job. He was like, everybody was so morbidly down on IU football, and trying to inject some enthusiasm into the atmosphere. And this, you can be good. You just were contending for a New Year's Six Bowl a couple of years ago. I mean, it's been amazing watching this whole thing unfold in real time, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. It'll probably be my favorite memory of podcasting when I'm finally done hanging this up in 10 years or so.
Yeah. And I mean, just going to get more interesting for this. I mean, this week's a huge one. I mean, this is the one that's okay, you can talk whatever you want about, do you get into the playoff? Do you not? How do you weigh this or that with the other 2-loss, 1-loss teams out there? If you beat this Ohio State team, I mean,
I know. And it's one of those where I've purposefully not let my brain go there, because I haven't really let my brain go there with any of the games so far. I've been I'm gonna do the cliche sorority girl Instagram post thing, and I'm just I'm gonna live in the moment. I'm just living in the moment, and I keep living in the moment. And I said that complimentarily about sorority girls on Instagram. I love that attitude. It's you get so weighed down by expectations of how things are supposed to be. It's nice to just be alive in the time and absorb the emotion and the feeling and let it organically come out of you. This is turning into a therapy session here, but I think that's
this has been Galen, I bring it up because I'm living in it.
I know
this season has been a therapy session for IU fans. I mean, where it my wife talking through what this is. Yeah, it's that balancing. How excited do I get? Oh wait, am I not excited? Who these dueling emotions of how you interpret this year. It's just been really funny. That's why I wanted your take on it. It's been funny to watch it kind of play out in real time. I mean, the funny one. So, and she'll probably get mad at me for saying this, but so she sent me a tweet today when I was at work. That was basically Ryan Day wants the stadium to be as loud as it's ever been.
I saw that
for the Indiana game. Right. And she essentially sent it as if how embarrassing. He wants it to be loud for, it's literally Indiana. And I'm hold on. You can't have it both ways. So this is, on one hand, it's you want to be considered at this level of disrespect. But then when you get it, you're still doing the literally Indiana thing when he's trying to give you the respect. And I was just that's been the balance of IU fandom is and she's just you're right. I'm just trying to protect myself because he's giving us respect.
That's what it comes down to. And Allie and I are on the same wavelength with this. We've talked about it on text quite a bit. It's you and we've had many of our listeners talk about this throughout the course of the season. You're so conditioned as an IU fan to getting kicked in whatever the most painful part of your body happens to be to get kicked in repeatedly, unmercifully, with nobody caring afterwards and everybody just laughing at you. So I think you automatically set up these emotional barriers where you don't allow yourself to wish cast something occurring because you've been down that road so many times. And again, it's you have to balance that. It's funny. I saw the Day thing. I think that's coming from a point of concern.
Yeah,
with Day,
that's
because
how I took it. That's why I didn't know why she sent it as a bad thing. I was he wouldn't say that unless he was yeah, we're going to need people to actually show up at noon because this isn't a walkthrough game.
Well, and I think it's a legitimate concern because, again, the weather's not going to be great. And your fans they're savvy fans. They know what to expect. They know they got to get up when Michigan comes to town. Nobody needs to be told that. You're going to get up when Penn State comes to town because it's always a top 10 matchup. You're used to just, the Indiana game is kind of okay, we're going to go, we'll enjoy whatever. We'll laugh at them. We'll drink some beers in the stands, whatever it is. There's a certain emotional place that you have to get as a fan in the stands to really channel the energy that makes these places so intimidating to play in. And if you don't come in with that, and I think even with Day saying that, I'm not expecting us Ohio State fans to have the same level of energy that you'd have for a normal top 5 matchup because it's Indiana. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be really interesting. And I gotta let you go in a minute because I got to get called into a meeting here. But the thing that's going to be interesting to me is can Indiana get points on the board first? Can they draw a little bit of blood? And what happens? How does Ohio State respond? How does the crowd respond? How does Indiana respond? That's that, and that ties into what we've talked about a couple of times in terms of the realities of the emotion and the way that players are able to interact with the surroundings that they're in the moment. Yeah. And you never know. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to talk about, because everything could be set up right. The statistics could say one thing, and then if Rourke goes out and throws 2 interceptions early like he did against Maryland, and suddenly you're down 14-0, well, Ohio State's suddenly feeling good. The crowd's into it. Everything's fine. Indiana's like, shit, we're climbing up a mountain. But if the opposite happens, that's where the big question marks come in. And that's the thing I'm probably the most fascinated by as we go into this particular environment.
Yep.
So.
No, I agree. Well, and I appreciate you having me on. I will say your podcast, and I think I told you this in person, but it has been very useful to my job too. You do a lot of the hard work when it comes to NIL and all the background explanation. I think I listened to your NIL explanation and the reorganization of all this stuff podcast a couple times.
Thank you.
Because you do a great job with that, getting all that information and kind of presenting it. So does not go unnoticed, even though you never know. There's some Ohio State fans out there just taking notes. And I've shared your podcast with others too. I was like, oh, you know what you need to do to get the big picture? Listen to this CrimsonCast.
Listen to the Indiana guy. That's great.
Yeah, get you some home field apparel while you're at
it. Right. Yeah, go get a Hoosier game day lager while you're at it. Yeah. Well, Dane, I appreciate you coming on. I mean, it's great to have you here, and appreciate your insights. Your insights were awesome throughout this. So we'll hopefully have occasion to do this again at some point soon.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. Dane Sanzenbacher from 97.1 The Fan in Columbus. We appreciate all you folks listening, as always, as we will continue with more interviews. We've got some other perspectives coming up this week. We'll also have Bison Chat tonight, 6:45 p.m. Eastern, as we will be recapping the bye week, and we will be watching the college football playoff rankings reveal for this week. So tune in for that. For everybody at the Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us here on CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.